Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today I want to talk about Dungeons and Dragons' new emerging D&D killer competitor, which is DC20. All right, so you're like, wait a second, Scott. I don't know if Dungeon Coach actually intended that to be a D&D killer. Doesn't matter what he's intended it. The community is already labeling it, and he was literally on a stream that actually labeled DC20 as the next D&D killer, right? So what I want to do is I want to look at every single aspect of DC20 and every major change it made from Dungeons and Dragons, that DC20 made from Dungeons and Dragons, and talk about whether it's good. And today I want to talk about the 4 action point system. All right, so let's talk about Dungeon Coach's decision to use 4 action points rather than using Dungeons and Dragons traditional move, action, reaction, right? So when it comes to action economy, Dungeons and Dragons is very simple, right? It is it has a move, action, reaction, and you can switch that. So you could take your action and do it first, and then you can move. And some classes can move, act, and then move again using a portion of its movement in each area, right? And then you have a reaction. So you have a number of reactions where you could take an action when it's not your turn, right? Now that is very simple, very direct, right? Now what is the 4 action point system? Well, first of all, it's a tired retread of what was already done in Pathfinder 2, right? So Pathfinder 2 has a 3-point action system. And so Dungeon Coach said, oh, let's do 4-point. Now, I think this is a bad idea because it's tired. It's very like non-imaginative and really inefficient. Or actually, it's non-innovative. It's non-innovative, right? And then the point is that you can use these points to do different things in your turn, and it's supposed to give you a lot more flexibility. Does it give you more flexibility? Absolutely. It gives you a lot more flexibility than what you'll find in D&D. Is that good? Absolutely not. This is a terrible idea. And the reason why is I think Dungeon Coach with DC20 in many points in the game, in DC, and I can say DC20 is a game. Dungeons and Dragons, I don't believe Dungeons and Dragons is a game. I think it's far more than that. DC20 is absolutely a game. Virtually everything that's ever copied Dungeons and Dragons is nothing but a game, right? They fell for the ruse, like, oh, let's make another Monopoly, whatever, and that's what you're seeing with DC20. It's fiddling with the dials, not installing any new dials, certainly not installing a new panel with slides or switches, right? It's just turning the dials on traditional Dungeons and Dragons and saying, oh, I didn't like this part, I didn't like that part, and let me replace them with the things that I like. And actually, I get why Dungeon Coach wants to do this, but there's no excuse for it today. There really is no excuse for it. I'm not kidding. I used to listen to it years ago, and I stopped listening to it a while ago because it was heartbreaking. But there was a podcast about heartbreakers, and it was just like, oh, this guy doesn't like this thing in Dungeons and Dragons, and so he made a new game copying Dungeons and Dragons. And that's really all Dungeon Coach has done here. And the sad part is he made the most classic mistake. He has simply added more complexity. And this is the way to make sure that you waste a huge amount of your time and a huge amount of other people's time. If you come for Dungeons and Dragons and you want to beat Dungeons and Dragons, you must make the system simpler. And DC20 does not do that. In virtually every new innovation that it does, it increases complexity. And that's exactly what the 4-point action system does. It massively increases the complexity of what Dungeons & Dragons had already established. Dungeons & Dragons is very simple. Move, action, reaction, right? And you can move those around in different orders. 4 action points, he allows he allows them to be configured individually by class. right? And all that's going to happen with DC20 is the most crunchy, mechanical, worst players and worst game masters are going to be attracted to it, right? And the only thing it's going to do is sheep shift away from Pathfinder, right? Pathfinder already scooped up all these horrible game masters and horrible players who are just there to cut goblins in half. They do not care about narrative. They do not care about interacting with the narrative in a intellectual, emotional, and spiritual way, right? They just want to interact with it intellectually. It's just a return to war games with a tighter focus, right? So in my opinion, Dungeon Coach's number one sin with DC20 is trying to fix Dungeons and Dragons by making it more complicated, which only attracts worse and worse and worse game masters and worse players, right? So I think this is the 4-action point is a bad copy of Pathfinder, and you do not want to copy Pathfinder. Not even Pathfinder 1 players generally hated that game. And it was a bad idea to copy Pathfinder, and it's always a terrible idea to roll at Dungeons and Dragons and try to defeat Dungeons and Dragons by adding complexity to Dungeons and Dragons. It will fail every time, and there are literally hundreds of games that have proven this. And there is one game that proves if you actually simplify D&D, you might be able to beat it. There's one game in the world that has beaten Dungeons and Dragons in design. One, right? And it still isn't a better game because it hasn't caught on. And most people won't play it, even though the rules of it really genuinely are better than Dungeons and Dragons. And that is Index Card RPG. Almost no one plays it. It has not picked up, right? I have already done a video asking that it be made canon into D&D. And that would be a huge change, right? But Dungeon Coach, I really think he worked very hard on this game, right? But he made the fundamental mistake about fixing Dungeons & Dragons. You cannot fix Dungeons & Dragons by simply adding complexity to it. It fails every time. And what shocks me is that people go into this stuff, invest tens of thousands of dollars, invest hundreds of hours, if not over 1,000 hours, and do not learn this lesson. It is astounding. I think this aspect that Dungeon Coach changed for D&D was a terrible change, and is going to make DC20 fairly unplayable, in my humble opinion. Every single word you just heard is my humble opinion. Nothing more, nothing less. What's important is when I hear your humble opinion, when you get in the comments and send your traffic. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a fetch millennium.